Welcome, everybody. Good morning to everybody here in this beautiful venue, the Amplifier in Berlin. And good morning, good afternoon, good night to all of the people joining us online through the live stream. It's great to all have you here for this very first Employer of the Future event powered by WorkMotion. People are still dropping in here. I hope it doesn't interfere with the audio too much online. So, my name is Pieter Manda. I'm the head of Trust and Compliance at WorkMotion, and I have the honor today to be moderating this event. And that means that I will be introducing you to a list of great speakers, all of them thought leaders in the future of work area, but also with their very own specialistic perspective that they'll be bringing today. And we're going to start off right away with the first one, because he is here to give you your official welcome. He is a serial entrepreneur, a co-founder, and my CEO of WorkMotion. His name is Carsten Lebtig.
Thanks, Peter. So good morning, everybody, and good morning, everybody at home. I want to take you back into 2006, when I started my professional career. And at that time, I joined what was for me back then my dream employer of the future. And what was so amazing about that employer was that I got a BlackBerry back then. And the BlackBerry, for those who still remember what this is, had two functions that were relevant to me. Number one, it enabled me to check my work email wherever I was. And this was kind of new back then. And the second great reason about the BlackBerry was that I could attach it here to my belt, and it gave me a lot of status. So people saw that I was wearing a BlackBerry, and they came to me and said, "Hey, you have this corporate device. Which company do you work for?" And I was super proud to mention the name of my employer back then. The main reasons why I joined that employer were two reasons. Number one was that I was looking for a corporate career. So I wanted to work for a company where over the course of 10, 20 years, I could essentially move up the ladder and make a big career. The other reason was that that employer provided one of the greatest benefits and one of the most relevant benefits at that time, which was international work experience. So back in that time, 16 years ago, this was a big thing. And I wanted to work for a couple of years abroad. So of course this has changed. Today's employers are different, and today we're discussing the employer of the future. And I want to share a couple of thoughts, what I think about work, what I think about employers, and what I think about challenges that the employer of the future has. And first I want to take you back in time, and we have to take a look at how work has evolved over the time. So I will take you back into the Greek society. Greek society, actually work was done by whom? By slaves, okay? Slaves and second-class citizens, because work was something really physical, and the upper class simply didn't like the work, okay? So that was work back then. And it pretty much stayed like this over the course of centuries until the Industrial Revolution. And in the Industrial Revolution, we saw like the first massive change in the way how we worked for the first time. People moved from the factories, from the farms, into the factories. So, and this pretty much changed how we were working. So all of a sudden, people had to work 14 to 16 hours a day in a factory, 6 days a week. Can you imagine that? And it stayed like this for a couple of years. That was, by the way, the first Industrial Revolution. Then we had the second one, which brought us electricity. We had the third one, which brought us computation. And the third Industrial Revolution, for me personally, was when my dad came to me in the 90s and told me, super proud, that he now had a personal computer at his work. So, and this really made his work way more productive than it used to be before. Today, we are in the so-called fourth Industrial Revolution, which started in 2010. And it's characterized by robotics, by artificial intelligence, bio and nanotechnology. And if we think about the employer of the future, we could now look into the future. So, and if we look very far into the future, like 30 years far into the future, 2050, there are, quite frankly, way more pessimistic scenarios than there are optimistic scenarios. So you've all heard it. Whatever can be automated will be automated, and machines will be replacing humans, right? And that's sort of frightening to some people. So many people are, and many studies are suggesting that there will be mass extinction of many, many jobs, right? And there will be a high unemployment rate, up to 20 to 25% globally. Today we are 10, 11%, I think. And a good example are drivers. So drivers, truck drivers, bus drivers, cab drivers, Uber drivers, Amazon package delivery drivers, all of those jobs will be mass extinguished over the next 30 years because there will be self-driving cars coming up. So let me ask you this. Do you think that there will be a bunch of unemployed drivers in 30 years from now? Today we have 11 million professional drivers in Europe. So I don't think so. And the reason is because we are quite good at adapting. So with the first industrial revolution from farms to factories, we had roughly 100 years to adopt, right? 90% of the farm jobs got eliminated, but we had 100 years to adopt with that change. The next phase from factories to the service economy that we have today was already a shorter adaptation phase, so only 60 years, but again, we adopted, 75% of factory jobs got eliminated over those 60 years. So what you can already see is that there's sort of a pattern. So the time to adopt is shrinking from 100 years to 60 years. And studies suggest that right now, in the current phase that we are in, we only have about 10 to 15 years to adopt to all of those changes that are going on. The good news is, we've learned in the pandemic that if we have to adopt, we can adopt quite fast. So in the pandemic, when knowledge workers had to move from the office to work from home, we essentially saw 5 years of innovation happening in 5 weeks, right? We all remember that. So that's the good news. So now I think we shouldn't look that much into the future. We have to be more like in the present and more like look at the next 5 to 10 years maybe. And the next 5 to 10 years in Europe will be determined by one of the biggest trends that we have, which is the shrinking labor pool, so to speak. So at the end of this decade in Europe, we'll have 14 million people less in the age to work than we had at the beginning of the period from 2020 to 2030. 14 million people we will be missing or will have less at the end of the period. At the same time, the economies are still growing, even though in the short term we might have a recession, but economies are growing and there is job growth, right? So the gap, today we call this the shortage of talent, is actually widening, okay? I believe, however, that the shortage of talent is pretty much a very local phenomenon, okay? If you take a look at different regions, so we have, on the one hand side, we have cities. There are 48 dynamic cities in Europe where 20% of the working population live, and these are the regions, the 48 cities, where the job growth will come from, okay? Those are the economies that are growing, and there will be new jobs. On the other side, there are roughly 30% of Europeans living in regions that are economically shrinking. So that's where jobs are being eliminated, okay? And in the middle, 50% are working in regions that are modestly growing, but not very much. So I believe that the shortage of talent is pretty much a phenomenon of those cities, and Berlin is one of those cities, and I guess many of you are from one of the 48 major dynamic cities. So how can we solve the problem of shortage of talent? There's 2 ways. One is we can take the people from the shrinking economies and move them into the cities, okay? We call this migration, or we call it mobility. But guess what? It's really hard to move into a city because the cost of living is skyrocketing, and it became unaffordable for many, many people, right? So, of course, there will be migration, but it doesn't close the entire gap. So the only other option, in my opinion, is to move the jobs from those regions, from the cities, into those regions where there's shrinking economies, okay? And that we call remote work. So I do think that the employer of the future has no way around thinking and coping with remote work. Now, remote work, and we've learned this over the last 2 years, comes again with a couple of challenges. We have learned that younger employees, Gen Z, they are thinking differently about work and about their employers. And it has become incredibly easy to change your employer nowadays. So if you want to work remote, you can literally work for any company in the world that offers remote jobs, okay? So right now, of course, we've all heard this, there's a great resignation going on. So going forward, what does an employer of the future have to deal with? I think there's two challenges that need to be solved. One is about culture, and the other one is about the well-being of the employees. On culture, I think what we as employers have to avoid at all costs is that we create two classes of employees, those that work in the office and those that do not work in the office, right, in a hybrid setup. Therefore, in my opinion, the employer of the future has to be world-class, for example, in communication, synchronous communication like meetings, and it has to be fair and inclusive. So if you have, for example, a meeting, there's 5 people sitting physically in a meeting room here in Berlin, and there's 5 people logging in via Zoom or Google Hangout. It has to be fair for all of them. It has particularly to be fair and inclusive for the 5 people that are not sitting in the room, okay? And we need to master that. So I think going forward, we have to design work and processes for those that are not in the room, okay? We call this remote first. So this is what the employer of the future has to do. On well-being, there's a big paranoia going on right now. And the paranoia is that there are managers on the one hand side. Managers constantly think that if they cannot see their employees, probably the employees are not working or are not being productive, okay? At the same time, there are the employees, and the employees state that they work longer and longer and longer hours. So now that their home became their office, they essentially live in the office, right? They are day and night in the office, and they are just one Slack message away from their managers. And without any commute, without any long lunch breaks, there's actually hard data out there that employees are working longer and longer and longer. So what we can learn here is that there is very little trust still today between managers and employees. Managers don't trust their employees, and employees don't trust their employers that they are taking care of them, right? And that's another call for action for the employer of the future, to really be proactive about well-being of the employees and to trust them. And well-being around financial well-being, physical well-being, and of course, psychological well-being, right? So we need new forms of surveys, new forms of one-on-ones, and other ways to connect to deal with that. I want to finish with a personal story from last week. So WorkMotion today is a company with roughly 300 employees, and the employees are distributed over 42 countries, okay? And last week, for the first time ever, we brought roughly 1/3 of those employees, so the entire revenue org, we flew them to Thessaloniki in Greece. So Rev org being sales managers, SDRs, marketing people, and so on. And the number one goal of that investment was to all put them in a big room or in multiple smaller rooms and to really let them work like in a productive way, right? So workshops, coachings, and create a lot of work output. This was the primary goal. In hindsight, our primary achievement was something entirely different. The primary achievement was that we enabled them to connect on a social level, right? So something that is also a big challenge of remote work. So remote work can be very transactional. So of course we know our very closest teammates, but like the ones that are a little bit further away from our small teams, we don't really know them, right? So maybe we know the name and we know the title. It's like a senior account executive DACH or something like this. But what do we really know about our coworkers? Not much, right? So on last week in Thessaloniki, we changed that. So it was amazing to see like how people were like interacting and like what happened outside those rooms that we had booked for them, right? So the dinners and the clubs and the party and so on. Because humans are actually pretty amazing when you talk with them and you learn about what they do on the weekends, right? So how they interact with their kids and what hobbies they have and so on. So I think that's another challenge that employers of the future have to think about, how to create the social interactions that we really don't have in a fully remote setup. With that, Today is our first Employer of the Future event. It makes us incredibly proud to see so many people here and so many people hopefully online. And it's a format where we bring together thought leaders and panelists, and of course all of you, you're also thought leaders, because otherwise you wouldn't be here. And we really want to see you like exchange ideas, exchange best practices, and learn from each other. Because at the end of the day, we are shaping the future together today. Okay? Thank you.